Outgoing First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Chief Ghislain Picard is stepping down after more than 3 decades, and he says Indigenous people risk being pushed aside in Canada's potential trade war with the United States. He joined us earlier to explain why he's concerned.
The simple answer to that is that Indigenous peoples are consumers themselves. So obviously they have their concerns are not less legitimate than the overall Canadian or Quebecois. So that's one issue. The other point is the whole notion or concept of the duty to consult has been defined, I mean, so many times over in the last 20 years. And to me, that principle really finds its place in the current debate, given that not only Quebec, but many different jurisdictions, including Canada, have said in this tariff measures that Canada and the provinces will hold on to what's theirs, and but the thing is, what is not mentioned is the fact that much of the wealth in Canada has been achieved through the exploitation of natural resources and the lands, which ultimately belong to First Nations. So I think this is where governments are sort of, have lost track of the history in this country. And not only the history, but the present as well, because we continue to have cases before the courts that are favorable to First Nations with regard to the ownership of lands and the natural resources therein. So to me, it should serve as a reminder that governments cannot act independently of the need to have First Nations involved.
He highlighted how different provinces have respected the duty to consult Indigenous people, specifically comparing BC and Quebec.
I'll take two examples, one Quebec and the other one British Columbia. British Columbia has a table called Team BC, and with a mandate to protect the interests of the province. And one of the first things that BC did is really to include First Nations representation at that table. In Quebec, we're nowhere near that. Instead, the premier will travel to Washington, saying that he's protecting the interests of the province, which is not, nobody will debate that or question it. But how he goes about it is probably where it becomes more. Where we need to become more pay more attention to. The same premier just 3 weeks ago, speaking about energy transition and the fact that Quebec is looking to the future leading to 2035, where there needs to be an energy transition, trying to stay away from fossil fuels and so on. He said, well, we'll have to do that work, but it's not going to be done, in isolation of the need to sit down with First Nations. So he says that about 3 weeks ago, and then he comes out challenging Trump and the U.S. Just days ago, about a week ago. Not a single mention of First Nations. Yet he says, well, maybe we're going to have to consider fast track on certain projects. Wind farms, possibly dams as well. So I think we have a premier that's that's speaking from both sides of the mouth in this case.
He also highlighted that First Nations leaders are closely watching Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
Well, obviously, we don't have a very good or positive history with the Conservatives, going back to the Harper years, but yet I think from a First Nation perspective, everybody's looking at the numbers, everybody's looking at the current political environment, and it's how would I call it, uncertainty in terms of what will happen next, and obviously the Conservatives are leading the polls, and we have a federal government, really trying to move to the next step, which is really to find a new leader. So all of that being considered, obviously leadership will listen to what Poilievre has to say. And Poilievre is speaking about a lot about economic reconciliation and making sure that First Nations have the means to create their own economy. And I think I just heard him say the other day, well, he wants First Nations to be, the richest people in the world. That may be, taking taking it a little too far. But this being said, I think people will listen. But at the same time, I think there are fundamental issues that that should be a centerpiece as well. And it goes back to the discussion we had earlier about the threat from the U.S. and how it impacts Canada and how it impacts First Nations as well. So it has to do with land and the resources and the ownership of lands.